What's the darkest secret you found out about someone close to you? Story 1. Not a secret, but just something strange. In the late 1960s, my maternal grandmother's husband divorced her and gave her partial custody of their 2 boys. During one of the visits, she took off with her 2 kids and moved them from North Dakota to California. Her entire family was Seventh-day Adventist, which is a tight community, so when she moved to California, she found an area that was very Seventh-day Adventist and sort of waited, knowing that the community would protect her from the authorities. Keep in mind that her previous husband had not been accused of abuse. She was just angry that she did not get full custody. This arrangement lasted from about 1968 to 1971. Finally, she had a falling out with either her adopted mother or her cousin, and they called her husband, who came and got the kids. My grandmother did not receive jail time for the kidnapping, but was not permitted to see the kids again. As far as I know, she has not seen either child since 1971. The Seventh-day Adventist Church later paired her with another parishioner who would become my grandfather. Neither my mom nor my aunts have ever met their half-brothers. According to my mom, my grandmother continued to talk about them obsessively right into her old age. She had a framed picture of them walking away from her. The story behind the picture is that they did not like living with her, and so when their dad came for them, they walked away from her and did not look back for the photo. Story 2. My dad's friend committed suicide by shooting himself in the head in front of my dad and some other friends when he was 15 years old. They were all hanging out at the friend's house having a good time when he went upstairs, grabbed his father's pistol, and came back down, calling everyone's attention. He then put the gun to his head, squeezed the trigger, and collapsed behind a couch. They all thought it was some sort of sick joke at first until they looked over the couch and saw his body and the blood. I first heard this story from my mom when I was 18, which explained some of my dad's behavior toward toy guns when I was a kid. But I never brought it up to him. I just hoped that one day he would open up to me about it, and eventually he did, but we have not talked about it since then. I am amazed by how my dad turned out to be such a great man after experiencing something awful like that at such a young age. But according to him, it is something that never left him. He still has nightmares about it and gets really uneasy in movies and television shows when they show someone getting shot in the head. Story 3. I do not know if it would be considered a family secret since my mom grew up in a small town where everyone knew, but my great-grandma died when my grandma was 4, and her father remarried a woman who had kids of her own. My step-great-grandma used to beat my grandma and her siblings horrifically as soon as their father left the house, lock them in the basement all day, and so on. Obviously, this had a terrible effect on them. My grandma grew up to do the same to her own kids, for instance. One of my great-uncles became an alcoholic. He also robbed graves. Apparently, he had a fascination with gold teeth, but he also stole jewelry and other things he could sell to buy alcohol. My mom says she remembers him showing up at the back door when she was a kid, covered in dirt, and her mom would always take him in for a while, feeding him, clothing him, and then he would go right back out to drinking and grave robbing. My mom always told me he died in an accident. Several years ago, though, one of my uncles told me that he actually died when he was found passed out on someone's front lawn. They had called the cops, and when they arrived and tried to arrest him, he woke up and started resisting. He fought the police, and they killed him. Story 4. This would not normally be a big deal, but it involves my father-in-law, who is a very active member and local leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. He is somewhat of a genius, so at the start of the pandemic, he built a distillery in his garage to make his own hand sanitizer. Within a few months, he started acting a little strange. One day, while explaining the distilling process to me, he gave me one of the bloated pieces of corn in the batch and ate one himself. That is when I realized he was not just making hand sanitizer, he was making and drinking some pretty strong moonshine. This is the same man who continues to look down on one of his kids for drinking coffee. My wife and her siblings have no idea and continue to blame his behavior on other things, such as exhaustion or internal imbalance. Story 5. I do not know if it is necessarily a secret, at least not in our family. It is more like a giant cover-up. I have a cousin who has sexually abused at least 7 young girls. Those are only the ones I know about. He tried to go after me when I was babysitting his kids once, but I stopped it. I called my mom, and she came to get me and beat him up. He had molested her for years, and when she came forward, his mother told her she must have liked it because she did not say anything sooner. He touched his wife's teenage daughter, and she still stayed married to him. He cornered the neighbor girl in their basement at a party. Once the list goes on. How he is not in prison is beyond me. I know more than one police report has been filed. I heard he has friends on the force, so those reports magically disappear. We have separated ourselves from that side of the family, and my mom still apologizes years later for leaving me in their house to babysit that day. His family thinks that because he went to counseling for 6 months and goes to church now, he has changed. It is like they have all come together to protect that disgusting man, and they can have him. We will never go near him again. Story 6. Growing up, I never understood why my dad could sometimes be so cold to my mom. When I was 13, he passed away, and I had to start dealing with my learned relationship habits. My aunts began telling me the story of his first wife. My father and she got pregnant, and he was called to the hospital and excitedly ran into the room to find her and her female lover standing there with the baby. They told him, "We are done with you, and she wants a divorce." It had been a years-long plan to have a baby with him, and he never even suspected anything. My grandmother said he was heartbroken for years. I probably hurt women along the way while trying to navigate relationships myself. Please do not make selfish choices that hurt others. It hurts more people than you think. Story 7. My mom recently admitted that she may have a half-sister somewhere. She has been interested in our family tree for a while and mentioned that she is scared to do a DNA ancestry test. When I asked why, she explained that her father, a known womanizer, had left his girlfriend just before dating my grandma. His ex-girlfriend found out she was pregnant, but my grandpa denied that it was his child. My grandma became pregnant with my mom, and he stayed with them for a few good years anyway. When my mom was 5 or 6, the ex-girlfriend and her family knocked on the door, still convinced my grandpa was the father. He was not home, and my grandma, with 2 young children, sent them away. And as far as we know, they were never heard from again. Now my mom is afraid to put her DNA out there in case she finds out the life-altering confirmation of a half-sibling 6 months older than her. She may never be ready to know, but it is sad that I may have an aunt I will never meet. Story 8. My wife is the result of a one-night encounter with an entire soccer team. Growing up, her mom would not or could not tell her anything about her father. She only showed her pictures of the team from that night and pointed to one of them. She said his name was Martin and made up some halfway truthful story about him. Fast forward 30 years later, I used DNA testing to track them down. I say them because I narrowed it down to a few brothers who were on the team. We would need a blood test to finally confirm it. Bobby says she is his. He admitted that he used to pretend to be Martin when hooking up with women. Unknown to us, the single brother decided to take the blame and claimed her, my wife, as his. They all had previous illegitimate children, and it almost cost one of them his marriage the last time. We met him, visited, and met the rest of the family. Everything was going great. A couple of times I casually mentioned that we still needed a blood test to confirm it. All of a sudden, Bobby, the single brother, said, "Hey, come help me with the grill." Okay. Once we got out there, he swore me to secrecy and then laid out the details. Man, we were all drunk. I think 8 different guys slept with her, and everyone else got something. As far as I am concerned, she is my daughter, and she believes I am her father. The family loves her. Let's keep it that way. Story 9. My brother and I, 7 and 3 years old at the time, were being given a bath by our mother when we heard a massive bang in the living room where my dad was watching television. We both started crying instantly, and my mother ran off to check what had happened. She came running back with tears streaming down her face and said, "Do not worry, everything is fine. Your dad accidentally shot his gun because he thought there was a burglar." We believed her, being young and naive. When we got out of the bath, we went to see our dad, who was still alive, and he gave us a big, unexpected hug. He assured us that he thought there was a burglar and showed us the bullet hole through the sofa, the chip in the floor tile where the bullet hit, and the squashed bullet itself. It was only recently that I remembered this memory, and it is now easy to see exactly what happened that day. My dad decided he was going to shoot himself on the sofa, but pulled the gun away from his head at the last instant, firing directly next to him into the sofa. It explains why my mother came running with tears on her face. She knew exactly what had happened and came up with a quick story to calm my brother and me. It also explains the huge hug my dad gave us when we saw him. He has not attempted suicide since and is still alive and well at 65 years old. Story 10. Long story short, my great-grandmother's first husband and the father of 5 of her children could not be convinced to stop seeing another woman in town. Eventually, this other woman became pregnant, and her family wanted my great-grandmother's husband to take care of the child. The deal they made was that he would leave and marry the other woman, and in return, her family would give my great-grandmother a large plot of land called the Hill. My great-grandmother eventually remarried and had 4 more children, including my grandmother. Fast forward 90 years. All the siblings of the family have grown up, had families, and passed away, and there was never clear information about who actually owned the hill anymore. A drilling company discovered a massive natural gas deposit under the hill and had all the great-grandchildren sign over mineral rights in return for regular checks. Now, every so often, the whole family gets an update on how much gas has been extracted from the hill, and checks are written out to all surviving great-grandchildren. Story 11. My dad tried to kill me when I was 3. My little brother was always sickly. He could not breathe well and often had spells where he needed to go to the hospital, though I do not know exactly what he suffered from. One day my mom told my dad that my brother was sick and needed money for medicine. My dad refused to give her money and said he would buy it himself. My mom started getting us ready to go to the pharmacy, but my dad told her no, that we would wait and my 4-year-old sister would watch us. My mom said absolutely not, and despite my dad's anger, she got us into the car. While we were driving, my dad began ramming into our car, trying to knock us into a ditch that would flip it and likely kill us all. My older sister screamed out the window and some random man leaned out of his car, yelling that he was going to call the police and that my dad better pray they did something because otherwise he would break my dad's legs himself. My dad sped off and my mom called my grandma, sobbing. My grandma called my dad and told him that if he ever did anything like that again, she would kill him and feed him to her hogs. This lovely story was my 23rd birthday present from my grandma after I told her I was upset because my boyfriend had broken up with me. Story 12. Mine is not as dark, but here it goes. My father was killed when I was young, and my mother could not really handle raising me, so I went to live abroad with my father's sister. Fast forward 11 years later, my mom died from cancer. During those 11 years, we talked and visited, and I would say we were even close at times. In the final stages of her cancer, my mom was barely functional talking about pine cones in Finland, while her sister started discussing inheritance matters with me. I knew my mom would not survive, but I did not want to think about what I might inherit before she was even gone. My father's sister warned me to be careful with my mother's sister, saying that when I was young, she did something that caused a huge rift between my parents. She would not tell me what it was because she did not want to change my perception of them. When my mom passed, my aunt said she did not want to talk about money or anything related to it, and told me to wait before filing for my inheritance. It turned out she had already filed for inheritance on behalf of my grandfather, who was the next of kin to my mother, making him eligible like me. My grandfather was dying of dementia at the time, and my aunt was his next of kin, meaning his portion would go to her once he passed. He died just weeks after I found out what she had done. Every time she contacted me, she asked for information that would help her get a larger portion of my parents' inheritance. My lawyer's handling this because I live in another country and cannot be there. The whole situation is awful because I had very fond memories of her from childhood, and it showed me how money can ruin anyone. I finally asked my father's sister about the secret she had kept, and she told me that my mother's sister and my father got drunk one day and slept together while my mom and I were home. They had an affair for a while too. I cannot fully blame my aunt because it takes 2 people to have an affair, but I definitely see her differently now, especially after everything that has happened. Story 13. There are a few stories, but I will share what I remember. There was a family member back in the 1950s or 60s, a man in his 20s. I think he was my grandmother's cousin. One day he took his father's car for a ride and crashed it, dying instantly on impact. What he did not know was that his father had been working on the car at the time and had disconnected the brakes. When I was about 5, my mother kidnapped me from my father. She and her friends abused and neglected me severely. When I was 7, my dad won full custody. He was a good father at first, but became increasingly verbally abusive as I grew older. It was not until I was a teenager that I learned my mother had a child with another man before she met my dad. She had abused that child too, forcing him to eat dog food from pet bowls on the floor, and he was eventually taken away from her. I also learned that my dad had not wanted to be a parent, and that my mother had intentionally stopped taking birth control because she wanted a reason to quit working. My dad would come home from long days at work to find she had not fed me, changed me, or cleaned, despite being a stay-at-home mom. I came to understand why my dad blamed me for everything, called me names, and told me he wished I had never been born. He resented me. The abuse I suffered became a family secret. Whenever I tried to talk about it, I was silenced because they did not want that shame attached to the family name. I am no longer in contact with any of them. Story 14. My cousin's dad murdered his own wife, sister-in-law, and mother-in-law, meaning my cousin's mom, aunt, and grandma. He burned down their apartment with the bodies inside and kidnapped my cousin, who was 3 years old at the time. He took my cousin to another country, where he abused him for years. He eventually married another woman who, I guess, knew what he had done. One day the new wife got angry about something and turned him into the police. He is now serving a life sentence here in the United States. He was arrested 12 years after the murders. My cousin tells me everything whenever he gets drunk. Sometimes he goes back and forth about his dad's innocence for some reason, saying things like, "Why would he murder everyone and then keep me? I think he was set up." It is really sad, but I am 100% sure he did the murders. I have not been able to find much information online about it usually. When I look it up, I only see that he tried to get parole in 2014 and was denied. Story 15. My great-aunt's daughter was murdered years ago, and it is believed that my aunt's sister's husband killed her because he had gotten her pregnant by raping her. He knew everyone would find out, so we think that is why he did it. There were many clues pointing to him, like how her remains were found next to an empty bag of dog food, the same kind he used to feed his dogs. Maybe a coincidence, but unlikely. She had also been at his farm a few days before, and he was spotted parked near where her remains were found. He was a sick man, and I have heard so many stories about how he tried to sexually assault other family members. Sadly, the investigation was dropped, and the murder remains unsolved. But my aunt is certain it was him. It caused so much tension in the family that, to this day, we still do not speak to each other because of it. Story 16. I found out that my father might have more children than just my siblings and me. My parents divorced when I was 9. It was not surprising since they never got along, but my dad was always secretive late nights out. Random numbers on his phone. After the divorce, he kept our birth certificates because his house was more secure than my mom's. For my 14th birthday, I got my nose pierced, so we needed a copy of my birth certificate. When we went to get it, I saw multiple other names under his records. He noticed me looking, shuffled the papers quickly, and eventually handed me mine. I never asked him about it, but I plan to take a DNA test to see if I actually have more siblings. I do not want to jump to conclusions, but I remember 2 names, Marissa and John. Story 17. A few years ago, my aunt came to visit me, and it was just to ask if I could recall ever being inappropriately touched by a family member when I was younger. I told her no and did not think much of it. Recently, I went to visit my cousin and her mother, another aunt, and realized that my uncle was nowhere to be seen. When I asked where he was, what she told me left me in shock and disbelief. My uncle had been sexually abusing his daughter, my cousin, for years, and my aunt had been in denial the entire time. After finally waking up, my aunt took him to court and got a restraining order, among other things. I felt deeply betrayed. My uncle and I had always been close, and I never imagined he could be a predator. My cousin now goes to therapy because she thought her father's abuse was normal. She had been groomed and manipulated for years, along with other trauma I will not get into. This topic remains taboo in my family, and according to some relatives, a few of my uncles have even tried to kill the predator uncle. Story 18. It started with my uncle pleading with me to free him from his hospital bed after being diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma. He wanted to go home. He was desperate. I loved him dearly. 3 weeks later, he passed away without saying another word to me or anyone else. When my mom was cleaning out his room, she found a lockbox with a note that said, "Whoever found it should throw it away." Instead, my mom opened it and discovered his secret. He was gay. The box contained gay travel books and photos of him alone in different places he had traveled to around the country. To this day, it remains one of the saddest things I have ever experienced. My uncle, a lifelong bachelor, had to lock away one of the truest parts of himself in a tiny box. That box haunts me. I keep thinking about the desperate look in his eyes that day in the hospital when he asked me to take him home. He wanted to get rid of the box, the shame he had carried his whole life. So incredibly sad. My heart goes out to everyone in the LGBTQ community. No one should ever have to hide who they are. Story 19. My dad had a mistress and a daughter with her. She was born about 3 years after I was. That part is not so unusual, but how I found out makes the story disturbing. My home life was rough, and the day after my 18th birthday, I left home for good. I joined the military, straightened out my life, and never looked back, especially not toward my dad. He died while I was serving, and I did not attend the funeral. After getting out, I went to college in my home state and met a girl named Mary in my physics study group. We got along great. We were both estranged from our families. We dated, lived together, had great chemistry, even talked about marriage, but eventually broke up after almost 2 years. We lost touch and moved on with our lives. Years later, I tried reconnecting with my mom, but she was still toxic and bitter, and now after a stroke, her mind is gone. She thinks I am her boyfriend and that she is in high school again. Fast forward many more years, and I took a DNA test through 23andMe. The results showed I had a half-sister. We shared a father. When I checked her profile picture, I realized it was Mary. She must have seen the same thing because she contacted me. We eventually talked on the phone, and she told me she never knew who her father was, only that he sent her mom money occasionally. I told her she had not missed much. We agreed never to tell anyone about our past relationship and to say we were just college friends if asked. I am not on social media, which helps, and we have only spoken a few times since. I still do not know what, if anything, I should do next. Story 20. I recently discovered some disturbing things about my grandparents on my mother's side, and I am about 90% certain that they killed and ate people. In the 1950s, my grandparents decided to elope and ran away into the jungle, where they built their own house, Robinson Crusoe style. My mother was born there, delivered by my grandfather himself. As you can imagine, my grandparents were extremely tough, self-reliant people. I was told that a group of bandits had been terrorizing nearby villages and may have stumbled upon my grandparents' house. It seems they might have kidnapped my mother when she was an infant. She does not remember, and my grandparents have only hinted at it. Apparently, my grandparents hunted the bandits down, killed most or all of them, and then salvaged their meat because food was scarce in the jungle. When I visited my grandparents as a child, they always warned me never to go near a certain mound near their house. To this day, when I ask about it, they say, "You can dig it up and see for yourself after we die." I suspect that mound contains the bones of those they killed and ate. Moreover, I was born in the same country as my father. When I was about 4, my parents fled to my mother's homeland, leaving everything behind. My father also cut off all contact with his family and never talks about it. From what I have pieced together, I believe he told his family about my maternal grandparents, and they urged him to leave my mother and me. He refused and was essentially disowned. Of course, all of this could be speculation. Maybe my family is just trying to scare me, but I am 33 years old now, and they still refuse to tell me the full story. Story 21. A long time ago, I learned that my family has a history of mental illness, the kind that causes hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, and violent behavior. My aunt has it the worst. I later found out that my grandmother used to keep her locked in her room every day, treating her like garbage and making her the house servant, because whenever she was allowed out, she would go do drugs, drink, or get pregnant. This happened between ages 14 and 17, before she was finally diagnosed and institutionalized. She spent years in an asylum from the 1960s to the mid-70s. After being released on medication, she was placed on disability and monitored by professionals. Later, my mom learned that she had been raped multiple times by staff during her stay there. Since then, my aunt has been under the guardianship of my mom and another aunt, and now lives in a halfway house for people with mental illness. In short, my mentally ill aunt was treated like garbage most of her life by my grandmother and was sexually assaulted for years while institutionalized, unable to defend herself or tell anyone what was happening. Story 22. I found out that my great-grandfather killed my great-grandmother. I never met him since he died before I was born, but throughout my life, I heard many good things about him. My mom would tell me how caring and calm he was. Then one day, I learned that he sometimes beat my great-grandmother, and during one drunken fight, he shot her. The worst part is that no one in the family called the police. They just hid it, and he never went to jail. I understand that this happened many decades ago, when things were sadly different and domestic violence was often ignored. But it was still shocking to me, considering that everyone in my family always spoke about him with smiles on their faces. My mom told me he regretted it for the rest of his life, and constantly talked about how much he missed his wife, but still, it completely changed how I saw him. Story 23. I was always bullied for having a big family. I was called a traveler all through school, but I never knew why my family was so large. I just assumed it was an Irish thing. That changed in 2019 when I discovered that most of my family were children of rape, and that my granddad was a serial rapist. I had always thought something about my family felt off. My grandparents were very wealthy, practically millionaires, and they were always giving money to their children for different things. Many of my relatives struggled with mental health problems and alcoholism, and my grandfather would pay for their therapy and rehab. I used to think that was generous, but it turned out to be hush money. I was the first grandchild out of 30 who was not raped by him. I did not know this growing up. Every Christmas, the eldest grandchild was given my granddad's debit card, and all of us could buy whatever we wanted. I thought it was a nice Christmas gift, but it was hush money. All of this came out in 2019. After years without reported incidents, my family thought it was over until the attacks started again, this time on the younger children. That was when everyone finally broke the silence. Victims came forward. Even people we had not known were victims. It has been 2 years now. It is horrifying, but also a relief to finally know the truth. Story 24. My great-grandfather liberated my great-grandmother from Birkenau concentration camp in 1945 and took her back to Edinburgh, where he married her, and they had my grandfather. My grandfather grew up idolizing his father, believing he was a hard-working man who provided for his family by working on the docks in Leith. Then on his deathbed, my great-grandfather confessed that he had been a gangster. He admitted to robbing and killing people and to running one of the most prominent gangs in Leith for years. He used his final moments to unburden his conscience, and it shattered my grandfather's world. Apparently, many people already knew except him. My great-grandfather also confessed to brutally abusing my great-grandmother throughout their entire marriage. I was not alive at the time, but the revelation devastated the family and was never spoken of again. I only learned about it myself a few years ago. Story 25. My dad is from Korea, and his mother never told him who his father was. She later married an American soldier, and they moved to the United States. My grandmother passed away last year, and shortly after, my dad's uncle called him, urging him to come home for a visit. My dad had not been back in 40 years. The uncle said he had a picture of his father and was finally ready to reveal the truth, but had waited out of respect for my grandmother while she was alive. My dad begged him to tell him over the phone, but he refused, insisting it had to be done in person. My grandmother was a cruel woman who treated my dad horribly. She blamed him for everything, shamed him constantly, and made him feel worthless his entire life. After talking it over with my brothers and some cousins who live in other states, we all came to the same unsettling suspicion. My dad's father might actually be his biological grandfather. When I told my cousin in Philadelphia that I was almost certain this was the case, She went completely silent, not agreeing, not denying. That silence said everything. My dad still has not gone back home, and I think he is terrified of what he will find out. Story 26. Growing up, I always knew I had an older sister. My mom spoke fondly of her and even got a tattoo with all her children's initials. I was told that my mom had been too young to provide for her first child and decided on adoption for her baby's well-being. Years later, I learned the truth. My mom was 13 when she got pregnant by a 25-year-old man. She hid the pregnancy until her last trimester. When my grandmother found out, she demanded an abortion, but it was too late. She told my mom that if she did not give up the baby, she would be thrown out on the streets with nowhere to go. She also threatened my sister's father, forcing him to sign away his parental rights or face prison. Then my grandmother offered the baby to one of her coworkers, who desperately wanted a child. She convinced my mom that her daughter would have a better life and persuaded her to let her go, with two conditions: that the baby be named Elle, and that my mom receive regular updates and possible visits. But a year later, my grandmother told the adoptive mother that my mom never wanted contact again, cutting all ties. She never even passed along the chosen name, though. Strangely enough, the baby was still given it. My grandmother continued working alongside that same woman for 10 years, as if nothing had happened. I found my sister on my 21st birthday. We had lived in the same town for years, had mutual friends, and had even crossed paths once without realizing it. Sadly, she had lived a difficult life, and my mother cannot stand the person she became. She refuses to see her or her children. Before my grandmother died, I was driving her to a chemo appointment when she told me her biggest regret was not catching on sooner and forcing my mom to go through with the abortion. Story 27. On my father's 18th birthday, his parents sat him down for a serious talk. Without any warning, they told him point blank that he was adopted. He did not believe them at first, so his mother showed him his birth certificate for the very first time. Another woman's name was listed as his birth mother, and under father it simply said rape. His adoptive parents explained that his biological mother had been a very young girl who became pregnant after being raped and gave him up at birth. Then came the second shock. They told him that his mom, the woman who had raised him, was actually his third mother. His much older sister had originally adopted him because she thought having a baby would be fun. But after a few months, she changed her mind and decided motherhood was not for her. When their parents found out she planned to return him to the orphanage, they were horrified because it would embarrass the family. So instead, they took him in and raised him as their own. His sister became his mother, and his biological grandparents became his parents. My father said he just sat there, frozen, unable to speak. His whole life turned upside down in an instant. And then, as if that was not enough, they told him that since he was 18 now, he should probably move out. Story 28. My story is not as shocking as some others here, but it is still deeply unsettling. My entire immediate family once conspired, under my mother's direction, to have me institutionalized, basically locked away in a mental hospital permanently. They even documented their plan in an email thread, describing in disturbing detail how they would make it happen. One of them accidentally copied me on the email, and that is how I found out. For context, I have epilepsy, but it is well controlled. There was absolutely no legitimate reason for such a plan. My mother's real goal was to take my son away from me and assume control of his life. I considered getting temporary restraining orders, but how do you do that against your entire family? Instead, I confronted them directly. A few months later, a police officer came to my door saying there had been a report of improper care of my son. I invited him in, and it was immediately clear everything was fine. He could not initially tell me who filed the report, but I suspected it was my mother, who lived 6 hours away. Eventually, he confirmed it. That was years ago, and I have not had any problems since. I do not think their plan would have succeeded, but the fact that they even tried still chills me to this day. Story 29. This story is about my own name. I am named after my father, which has always caused confusion with insurance, loans, and banks constantly mixing us up. I was born at 24 weeks in 1987, and when I was delivered, the doctor told my mother I had less than a 10% chance of survival. He said, Either we bury the child with the father's name or without a name. We need to save space in the neonatal intensive care unit for babies that have a chance to live. Back then, they did not have the advanced equipment they do now, not even baby ventilators that could handle such small lungs. The medical staff had to manually modify machines, which helped pave the way for the technology used today. My mom had me transferred to another hospital as soon as possible because she could not bear to see that doctor during rounds. I stayed in the neonatal intensive care unit for about 6 or 7 months. The nurses there gave me a nickname, and I have gone by that name my entire life. It was always hard explaining to teachers or new people that the name on the paperwork was not the name I used, since my nickname and legal name do not even sound alike. I learned the full story of my name when I was 17, and my parents had kept it from me because it was so dark. I already knew parts of it since I appeared in newspapers and magazines at the time as a medical miracle baby. The best part came full circle in 2017 when my twins were born at 29 weeks. One of the nurses who helped save my life decades earlier cared for my sons during their neonatal stay. She and my mom shared photos and stories. It felt like everything had come full circle. Story 30. I will not go into the darkest details, but here is something more innocent. Both of my great-grandfathers lived to old age, and since I did not speak Finnish very well, our Sunday conversations were always a mix of broken words and translations. As a kid, my grandfather and great-grandfathers would sometimes pour me a little brandy and even let me smoke while they talked. They would trade war stories, and my grandfather would often have to translate for me. Some of the stories were brutal cutting off hands, cutting out tongues, and, in the worst cases, beheading enemies and putting their heads on fence posts. They said the only men they hated more than Nazis were the Russians. I still remember the look in my great-grandfather's eyes when he described slashing a man's face, but letting him live so he could live in shame. He said it with the kind of rage only a killer carries. Yet everyone called him a great man. When they spoke of Helsinki, they said that even if it were 1 to 10, they would have fought to the death. A Finnish man, they told me proudly, is worth 15 Russians, and we weren't even close to 1 to 15. Story 31. My mom was almost sent to prison for murdering her mother. My grandmother had become very sick, and none of my mom's siblings or other relatives wanted to take care of her, so my mom took on the responsibility alone. I only learned about this years later when, as a nosy teenager, I accidentally read my mom's old journals. She had cared for my grandmother for about 1 or 2 years before she passed away, but her death came sooner than her doctors expected. My mom panicked and didn't know what to do, so she just sat beside her mother's body for 3 days, frozen in grief and shock. The police were eventually called when she didn't return to work, and my godmother grew concerned. When they found her, she was taken into custody, and my aunt and uncle accused her of killing their mother. My godmother was the only one who stood by her and tried to help. My mom was never charged, but the experience has haunted her ever since. That event ended up shaping her entire life. She became a hospice nurse, dedicating her career to helping other families through the same kind of pain she once endured alone. Story 32. I met my grandfather for the first time last year, and he shared stories I never expected to hear. Before meeting my grandmother, he had dropped out of school after 6th grade, and for reasons he couldn't explain, eventually forgot how to read. He worked labor jobs for landscapers until he turned 18, then tried to join the army but was rejected. Angry and disappointed, he ran away to New York City, where he played guitar on the streets to earn money. One night he went to a bar, got drunk, and ended up in a fight. A man threatened him with a gun, and when the man turned his back, my grandfather hit him in the head with a beer bottle. He blacked out and woke up 3 weeks later from a coma, surrounded by police officers who told him that the man had died. He was sentenced to life in prison, but was released after 3 months when further investigation proved it was self-defense. He went back to work, rebuilt his life, and didn't learn to read until he was around 70 years old. Hearing him tell this story, smiling through the memories, made me realize how much life he had lived before anyone in our family ever really knew him. Story 33. My grandfather on my mom's side was not a good man. My mom told me everything about him, and it changed how I saw our family forever. For the first 5 years of her life, he pretended to be her uncle. Only when she turned 5 did her mother finally tell her the truth, that he was actually her father. They lived in a huge house because my grandfather had made a lot of money, enough to send some of his son's children he had with other women to study abroad. But my mom, because she was white and a girl, was left behind. He openly discriminated against her for her skin color and gender. This all happened in Peru, where most people are brown-skinned, and my mom stood out for resembling my father, who was Hispanic. Despite her excellent grades, she was never given the same opportunities as her brothers. She and her mother lived in a cramped room inside that big house, while everyone else enjoyed comfort. Many of my mom's half-siblings resented her simply because she was the other woman's daughter, even though her mother eventually became my grandfather's official wife. She endured years of bullying and isolation, and when she finally married my dad, a soldier, it was mostly to have someone to protect her. My grandfather never truly changed, at least not until his final days, when he left most of his property to my mom and a few of his sons. None of the others cared for him anymore. My mom forgave him and was the only one who took care of him as he grew old, while everyone else abandoned him. But I can't forgive him. Every time I visit his grave, I can't bring myself to pray. After everything he put my mom through, forgiveness just isn't something I'm capable of giving. Story 34. When my oldest brother was 19, he suddenly broke up with his girlfriend of 6 years, moved out, and never spoke to our mother again. He eventually moved to the other side of the world. No one ever explained why. Whenever I asked, all I got was, "Ask them about it, maybe they'll tell you." Years later, when my girlfriend got pregnant, our mom became overly involved, too physically intrusive, too controlling, until we had to distance ourselves from her completely. When my brother found out my girlfriend was pregnant, he reached out for the first time in years and told me one thing: do not let her near your girlfriend. I didn't understand at first. Then my mom started trying to convince me to leave my girlfriend and let her raise the baby alone while I focused on school. When I confronted her about it, she brushed it off as a joke, but something didn't sit right. I kept digging, putting the pieces together, and eventually learned what really happened years earlier. My brother's girlfriend had been pregnant before they broke up. She told my mother about it in person. Shortly after, she miscarried. They split immediately afterward, and my brother left the country not long after that. The implication is horrifying that my mother somehow caused his girlfriend's miscarriage, maybe even intentionally. And when I realized she might have tried to do the same to my girlfriend, everything made sense. It explained his warning, his silence, and the distance he had kept all those years. Story 35. My grandfather started dating my grandmother when he was 20 and she was 13. Within a few months of their first date, she got pregnant, but her family never told him. Instead, they waited until the day he came to pick her up for another date and told him she had been sent to live with cousins several hours away. He didn't understand what was really happening and got angry, thinking she'd left without saying goodbye, so he never tried to contact her again. One of her cousins quietly adopted the baby. About a year later, my grandfather joined the army and was stationed overseas during World War II. Meanwhile, my grandmother moved back home and began writing him letters again. After the war ended, they reunited and got married. She was 17 by then, and he was 24. They went on to have 2 daughters. As far as anyone knows, my grandfather never found out about that first child. My grandmother passed away in 1996, but my grandfather lived to be 92 and never showed any sign that he knew. I seem to be the only one who's pieced it together. When I tried to tell my mom what I discovered, she shut me down immediately. She refuses to believe her parents were anything less than perfect. Story 36. This one isn't about me, but about my husband's grandfather, the man both he and our son are named after. The official family story is that he was killed by a drunk driver, and that's why my husband's grandmother became such a bitter woman. The family still clings to the image of him as a wonderful father and husband, and even his widow, who kicked him out when she discovered his affair, never said a single harsh word about him to the grandchildren. But after living in the same small town for years, I started hearing things. It turns out he was visiting his mistress the night he died. The accident really happened, but it spared my husband's grandmother a public divorce. She kept everything, the houses, the property, the business his parents had built, but she stayed bitter and cold for the rest of her life. Whether that was from heartbreak, guilt, or denial, no one knows. The family's obsession with keeping up appearances is astonishing. I had suspected the truth for years but never said anything. After all, he died long before my husband was even born. It only came out recently when my mother-in-law, during her own string of affairs, slipped up and mentioned it to my brother-in-law, maybe to justify herself. It was a shock to everyone, though apparently half the town already knew. It's sad, really, this family's so desperate to look perfect on the outside, yet full of pain and secrets within. If only they'd been honest years ago, my husband might have been spared the heartbreak of learning the truth secondhand. Story 37, I'm a junior. I have the exact same 3 names as my dad. Back when Googling yourself first became a thing, before MySpace even existed, my buddy called me one day laughing because he'd been searching everyone in our friend group online. He said, "Dude, you've got to see this." There was a website that said, "The disgraces junior father looking for?" Apparently, my dad had fathered a child with a sex worker when he was in the Navy, and he had no idea. To make it even more awkward, she was only a few days younger than my oldest sister. At the time, my dad was going through a rough divorce, so he didn't reach out. Years later, I got a message on MySpace from an international family finding service. I forwarded it to him, figuring he'd know what to do. By then, he was remarried and in a better place emotionally, so he decided to reach out. They met a few times, kept in touch with phone calls, and built something like a long-distance relationship. She's a nurse now and has a daughter of her own. I don't know all the details, but from what I can tell, things turned out okay. It's not exactly a dark family secret, but it's one of those strange stories that somehow ended with healing instead of hurt. Story 38. My grandfather wasn't my biological grandfather, and from what I know, he was an awful man. He married my grandma when my dad was still a kid, my dad being from a previous relationship. Grandpa gave him his last name anyway, but he made sure my dad never forgot he wasn't really his son. He was in and out of prison, a drug addict, violent, and manipulative. He used my dad as a tool, forcing him to lie to the police by saying he couldn't eat until his dad came home, so the officers would let him visit. When he was home, he beat my dad constantly, as if punishing him for not being his biological child. He also abused my grandmother. Despite all this, people said he was handsome and charming. That didn't stop him from sleeping with a 13-year-old girl and getting her pregnant. After that, he told my grandma to leave the house and went to live with that child. He died before reaching 50, which feels like grim justice. What amazes me most is that my dad, after growing up in that hell, turned out to be the kindest man I know. He treats me like a princess. Somehow, he broke the cycle that should have destroyed him. He's my rock, and I'll never understand how someone raised in such darkness could choose to be light. Story 39. When I was little, I thought my grandmother was one of 4 daughters born to my great-grandparents. That's what everyone said. Then one day I was flipping through the family Bible, which listed births, marriages, and deaths, and I saw a 5th daughter's name. I asked my grandmother who she was, and that's when I learned the truth. My great-grandfather had been married once before. He was about 20 when he married his first wife, and they had a daughter together when he was 21. But his wife cheated on him with a wealthy man, took their daughter, and left him. 17 years later, she came back and tried to reconnect. By then, my great-grandfather was remarried to my great-grandmother and had 2 children with her. His first daughter moved in for a while, but she never stopped looking down on the rest of the family. She called them poor, complained about money, and eventually left again, this time for good after marrying another rich man. No one ever heard from her again. If she were alive today, she'd be nearly 100 years old. There could be a whole branch of cousins out there we'll never know. I also learned from that Bible that my great-grandfather was a junior, but he dropped the title because he despised his own father for abandoning the family. His dad had run off with a mistress and started a new life, leaving them broke. When his father tried to reconnect years later, showing off his wealth, my great-grandfather told him to his face that he wanted nothing to do with him ever again. So from that single Bible, I learned that my family has a long history of broken homes, lost relatives, and people choosing pride or money over love. Story 40. My aunt on my dad's side grew up believing she was just like the rest of her 5 siblings, same mom, same dad, same big loud family. But a few years ago, she learned the truth. She was the only one who wasn't biologically related to my grandma. When she was a baby, she was adopted by my grandparents, though nobody ever told her. Her biological mother was actually the woman my grandpa had an affair with. My grandma wanted to raise her, not out of compassion for the baby, but because she was the child of her unfaithful husband. The affair ended when my grandpa left the other woman, and that woman signed away her parental rights out of spite. She didn't want my aunt if she couldn't have him. My aunt didn't find out until my grandma was on her deathbed, when she confessed everything. They never spoke about it again, and that wasn't even the only secret. My grandpa had also slept with an older woman who had a son none of my aunts or my dad ever knew about. My dad lived 35 years before discovering he had a half-brother, only to learn that the man had already died. But here's where it gets even crazier. That half-brother had a son, and that son turned out to be my dad's boss. Nobody knew until my cousin and my dad's boss both took a DNA test through 23andMe. When my cousin saw my dad's boss listed under people you're related to, the family started piecing things together. Now my dad goes to work every day for his nephew, and they both laugh about how insane their family tree really is. Story 41. My college professor uncle always gave me the creeps, even though everyone else seemed to love him. His students adored him, his colleagues respected him, and even his online reviews described him as attractive, despite his receding hairline and awkward mannerisms. But I knew something was off. It was his birthday, and since I was attending the same college where he taught, I was asked to deliver his gift. I knocked on his office door. He told me it was unlocked, so I stepped in. The room felt unnaturally cold, like the air itself didn't belong there. He was staring intently at his computer, barely acknowledging me, until he suddenly said, "Come here, take a look at this." On his screen was a list one that made my stomach drop. Titles like Dark Family Secrets, Worst Advice You've Ever Been Given, Creepiest Thing That's Happened to You, Job Interview Horror Stories. He noticed my reaction and smirked. Then in a low voice he said, "Nobody knows this, but I post these exact questions on Reddit every week. No one moderates common topics, so I karma farm the accounts and sell them to astroturfers." I didn't even know what to say. My mind went blank. I just ran. I sprinted down the hall and didn't look back. I couldn't prove anything, but I told people what I'd seen. Word spread fast, and before long, his colleagues stopped trusting him. His once-packed classes now sit half empty. Maybe he'll get caught someday for whatever else he's been doing, but for now, at least he's not fooling anyone anymore. Story 42, I found out my wealthy grandfather was one of the early architects of dark money in American politics. Back in 1996, he worked alongside the Koch brothers and several other donors to create shell companies that secretly funneled money into 26 senatorial campaigns. It was a pilot program for what would later become a massive network of political dark money that's reshaped U.S. elections ever since. For example, Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas, who helped run that state's economy into the ground, was one of the first to benefit from my grandfather's funding network. My grandfather didn't just donate. He strategized, coordinated, and used corporate loopholes to hide millions in political influence. Only 3 people know about this: me, my cousin, and my grandfather himself. I confronted him once, asking how he could justify helping build something that's corrupted democracy and made it harder for ordinary people to have a voice. He just shrugged. He told me he'd only paid a $25,000 fine to the Federal Elections Committee and acted like that was the end of it. No remorse, no reflection. To him, it was just business. But to me, it feels like he helped open the floodgates to a kind of chaos we're all still drowning in. Story 43. Maybe not the darkest story, but definitely one that shows how broken my family is. My dad's side has always been strange. Somehow, I'm the only one who ever really did anything with my life. When my parents got married, my mom's parents bought them a house. 9 months later, I was born, almost to the day. But when I was 5, they divorced, and my paternal grandfather told my dad he should move back to California because he had nothing left here. I've never liked that man. He's the kind of person always chasing some shady way to make a quick buck. My dad, thankfully, stayed in North Carolina. Then in June of 2020, my dad's stepmother died of brain cancer, and my grandfather decided to move out here. My dad can't stand him, but pretends to be civil. My grandfather brought my cousin from Utah. His mom, my aunt, died in 2007 when he was only 8, and his dad's been in prison for years. The poor kid had been sleeping on friends' couches for 3 years before my grandfather dragged him across the country. My other aunt and cousin moved out here too, and for a while there were 5 people living in my dad's 2-bedroom apartment. Eventually my grandfather, aunt, and cousin moved out, leaving the one cousin behind. No diploma, no parents, no direction. My dad and he clashed constantly until, a couple weeks ago, my dad kicked him out. Now he's working part-time in fast food, staying with a coworker, barely surviving. It makes me sick how easily my family abandons each other. And honestly, my dad isn't blameless. When I was a kid, he'd threaten to beat me nearly every day, once even slamming me against the wall with his hand around my neck. It's something I still can't forget. On my wife's side, things aren't much better. Her dad cheated on her mom, left her and her 2 brothers, married the woman he'd been seeing, and had a son with her. Now at 57, he and his 36-year-old wife are expecting another baby. My wife will soon have a half-sister 26 years younger than her. Our kids will have a half-aunt just a year or 2 older than them. Sometimes I just look at both sides of our families and think, how can people be so careless with the people they're supposed to love? Story 44. When I was around 10 or 12, I asked my mom if one of my aunts on my dad's side had gotten divorced. I'd never met her husband, even though I knew she had adult children, and my parents always argued whenever she called. My curiosity got the better of me. That's when my mom sat me down and told me the truth. My aunt had been married once, but she had a gambling addiction that spiraled out of control. She pushed her husband into massive debt, and when things got desperate, she convinced him to embezzle money from his job to keep them afloat. He got caught, and instead of facing prison, he hung himself. Even that tragedy wasn't enough to make her stop. For years, her family gave her money, bailing her out time and again, hoping she'd change. My dad was the last one to cut her off, only doing it after my mom threatened to divorce him if he didn't stop enabling her. That's why I never met my cousins. They wanted nothing to do with her. Eventually, after everyone stopped helping, my aunt moved a few 100 kilometers away from the nearest casino and finally got control of her addiction. She's been clean for years now, has reconnected with her kids and grandkids, and lives what looks like a decent life. Ironically, she's now incredibly judgmental, like she's forgotten the chaos she caused. I don't particularly like her, but I can't deny I'm glad she recovered. Still, it's hard not to think about her husband, the man who might still be alive if she just walked away from the tables instead of from reality. Gambling destroys more than money. It shatters entire families. Story 45. When I was a kid in the early 90s, my brother and I were told that our uncle and 2 little cousins had died in a car crash. It was heartbreaking. They were the closest family we had. We adored those kids. I used to imagine they were still out there somewhere, that the crash wasn't that bad, that maybe we'd see them again. But time moved on, and nobody ever mentioned them after that. Fast forward to 2015. I'm married, we've just bought our first house, and one day I randomly start thinking about my cousins. I wanted to find their graves, pay some kind of respect, you know. So I searched their names online, and what I found made my blood run cold. It wasn't a car crash. There was an old newspaper article about a murder-suicide. A father who killed his children and himself. Near the bottom of the article, I saw their names, my uncle and my 2 cousins. He'd been going through a divorce, and my aunt was getting full custody. So instead of letting her have them, he smothered the kids with a pillow and shot himself. I called my mom after I read it, shaking. I told her I wasn't angry, that I understood, but I needed to know why she'd lied. She broke down and told me that her parents, my grandparents, had made her promise never to tell us. They couldn't bear for the truth to stain the family while they were alive. My brother and I agreed to keep the secret, even after finding out. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, and my grandmother's in a nursing home now. I've told a few close friends, but the weight of it still lingers. The knowledge that while I was growing up, mourning what I thought was a tragic accident, the truth was so much darker than I ever could have imagined.